Serious, park rangers / fish and wildlife workers / hikers of Reddit, what is the weirdest or most unexplainable thing that you've ever seen? I was a seasonal ranger back in the late 90s whilst in college. We got a call about a woman screaming off one of the biking trails. We searched for hours and never found any evidence of foul play, so we decided to head back. We were a good 5 miles off the trail by this point when we stumbled upon a couple acres of marijuana, a heavily booby-trapped couple of acres of marijuana, a dozen bear traps, a shotgun rig to go off when you walk into a string. There was a 10 feet deep pit covered with branches with spikes at the bottom. We later discovered there were dead deer that fell in and died. We got lucky it wasn't dark when we stumbled upon this, otherwise I'm pretty sure one of us would have died. Lots of agencies got involved. We never determined who was screaming, nor did we find out who owned the plot of weed. Why they would booby-trap the shit out of it was mind-boggling. Potentially killing someone over some plants seemed pretty effed, but no one was hurt from it as far as I know. That was a very interesting job. I wouldn't mind doing it again at some point. I am a hiker and surfer who saw maybe 2 kilometers of dead birds on the shore walk to my favorite break. Some were also floating in the water, going in and out with the tide. I worked for Colorado Parks and Wildlife for a few years, and we had this happen in our park. Waterfowl would just die on the water and on the shore. The ones still alive would have their necks droop over and die shortly after. It turned out to be botulism, and all the carcasses had to be disposed of as soon as possible. I was doing some field work for my master's thesis on the local river habitat. I have trail cameras out to catch wildlife. On my way to one of my cameras I was walking. I heard leaf rustling from the top of a tree, and then a dead deer fell from the tree on the ground. I made some noise and walked away. I thought it was either a bobcat or mountain lion, and I didn't want to investigate in case the animal was still there. As far as I know, bobcats don't climb on trees to carry their prey, and this was a whitetail that looked pretty heavy. I went there a few hours later and the carcass was gone. As for mountain lion, we only have rumors of one around our parts, and although I saw tracks, they were not near the camera. 1. I interned at a national wildlife refuge in the Bay Area, and lived in housing provided on site. There was a ground squirrel burrow near my window. We also had quite a few foxes in the area. On more than one occasion, in the middle of the night, I was woken up by what sounded like screaming kids. It was creepy AF, and that was how I learned what foxes sound like when they're raiding a ground squirrel burrow. 2. Trail running in the Seattle area. I had just finished a tough hill and was starting to drop down the other side. I got a good head of steam and was just enjoying letting gravity do the work. All of a sudden, a coyote darted out of the bushes right in front of me. I had too much momentum to stop in time, so I instinctually jumped over it to avoid a collision. I kept running, and he disappeared into the bushes on the other side of the trail. Pretty sure both of us kept running thinking WTF? When I was 11, I went tent camping with teenage cousins on the Sioux Reservation. They lived on the reservation. We were in an area we had followed several trails to find. We were inside the tent and they were telling me a story about shapeshifters as the sun was going down. Suddenly, there was a beautiful glow, like when the sun bursts out through clouds and makes everything golden. It highlighted shapes going by the tent and casting shadows, and started as a nice experience. Then there was a loud boom, and the shadow of a large bird came right at us and the tent fell down on top of us. They were genuinely scared, which made me even more terrified. We hightailed it back through those trails and went home in the dark, barely able to breathe, we were going so fast. I still don't know what happened or why, but I can tell you I don't go tent camping. I was walking through the woods once with my cousins and we found a very large half-eaten mushroom. A few paces after it was an abandoned pair of pants. May have been unrelated to each other, but it was weird. I once escorted a church group, ages young kids through adults, on a weekend overnight outing to a camp in the Poconos. The camp was set at the confluence of 2 streams and was somewhat rugged. The group had lots to do, a climbing wall, boating, hiking, sports, all kinds of stuff, including a nature center and little museum. The nature center had interactive displays, fish tanks, small animals, etc., and a touch table, a large wooden table with sides, on which was scattered all sorts of artifacts the guests could pick up and handle. These items included deer antlers, bones, turtle shells, feathers, arrowheads and pottery, rocks, seeds and nuts, tanned hides, etc. Little kids especially loved it. All of the items were found by guests or staff while out in the camp, and returned to the nature center. I handled the items also, and I noticed one bone had a really odd shape. I am an environmental scientist by profession, and an outdoorsman and naturalist for fun, and can generally recognize what bones came from what parts of what animals. This bone was a human mandible, the lower jawbone of a person. It was severely worn smooth and had no teeth, but easily recognizable as such. It had been there for years, handled by thousands of people, and no one noticed or at least reported it. I reported it to the director, who removed it and notified the state police. They investigated it. It seemed very old, and no one was reported missing in the immediate area, so the camp was allowed to keep it. Possible explanation: the facility was the site of a timbering and ice harvesting camp up until the 1920s, and may have been the remains of a worker who died and was buried right there. But who knows the real story? And as far as I know, it's still on the table. I went backpacking for 3 days with some friends like January 1st of this year. First night I was there, I was sleeping in my 2-person tent with one of my buddies, and I started to hear something walking outside of the tent around 4 a.m. I think it's probably just some animal. There are elk everywhere, who knows, but I'm safe. I try going back to bed, but it sounds like whatever is out there just keeps pacing the tent back and forth. I turn my head so the back is facing the corner of the tent, and it felt like there was something moving its face into the tent trying to smell me. I stay very still, hoping whatever is there goes away. Then all of a sudden it stops and just misses my head. I remain still and get the feeling of it moving its head in again. I quickly elbow it, but nothing was there, and I heard no more noises after that, not even running if I spooked it. I grab my pistol that is in the other corner and wake my buddy up and tell him the situation. I open the tent and look outside. Nothing. I still have no clue what that could have been and wished I opened the tent when it was pacing. We went backpacking in Yosemite and we were in the middle of nowhere. We had not seen people in days. We pitch the tent and fall asleep. I wake up in the middle of the night from the snoring very loud. I hear something pacing back and forth outside the tent. I'm paralyzed from the fear. I want to wake up the but I'm afraid if I do he might attract whatever's outside to us if he stops snoring or talks loudly. I just stay still and hope it goes away. I hear it come to my side of the tent and hear the dump of its heavy step. I can't see a shadow, but I heard it sniffing the tent close to my head. I swear to you I wanted to run so bad, but just had tears rolling from my eyes instead. We didn't have a weapon and bear spray is not allowed at Yosemite. All of a sudden, the thing stops making noise. I didn't hear any thumping indicating it was leaving. Eventually, I was able to fall asleep. In the morning I checked for tracks but didn't find any. I suspect it was a bear because it sounded too heavy to be anything else. I'd quit to believe TBH, but I can tell you I have never in my life have been that afraid. After spending so much time in the field and hanging out with other wildlife people, I suspect that there are many things the average person would find very weird but I find normal. At the same time, there are things that the average person might see as normal that are weird as hell to me. Something as simple as seeing crows and starlings flocking together unnerves me, while for most people they would probably be like, huh? A bunch of birds. The weirdest thing that comes to mind is a bizarre beaver dam I was dealing with yesterday. A beaver had clogged up the control structure for a stormwater pond. That isn't that weird because they do it all the time. Usually, they just pile up some sticks on the outside, then pack a bit of mud into it and call it a day. Not this guy. Instead, he decides to crawl into the drainage pipe with the sticks and build the dam in there. He then stacked up more sticks and mud until he reached the top of the structure. All told, there was probably about 5 or 6 feet of concrete pipe that was packed solid. I don't even know how he managed to do it, because even when we just got a trickle of water running through, the current was enough that we were getting worried about being sucked in. Once it was actually clear, it was a powerful torrent that should have swept any beaver away long before they could build anything. I'm none of these, but I've lived in rural Maine my whole life. I grew up in a small town called Livermore, and there's a place called the Norlands that still lives like it's the 1800s. It's a place kids take field trips to and learn about the old ways of life, but there's all kinds of spooky shit that happens up there. Anyway, driving in that area one day, I swear I saw what looked like a Bigfoot, except it was in a tree and swung down the branch, then disappeared into the foliage. The thing was massive. It may have been a bird, and I didn't get a good look at it, but what my brain saw was a gorilla/Bigfoot creature swinging from the trees. Not in that profession, but grew up in very rural Arkansas. Once stayed in a tent in the backyard with a friend when we were about 12, camping. I had a dog named Shadow that stayed outside and she was the bestest girl. My backyard butted up against hundreds of acres of woods, so coyotes and bobcats were pretty common but never came onto the property because of Shadow. That night as we stayed in the tent reading scary stories and talking girl talk, we heard what sounded like a woman screaming not that far away. I froze because my dad had told me that mountain lion sounded exactly like that, and I wasn't sure we'd even make it back to my back door if we made a run for it. My friend was terrified and thought a woman needed help, and I was trying to tell her that we had no neighbors for miles, and what I thought it probably was when Shadow started growling just outside the tent. I have probably never been so terrified before or since. She started barking and moving away from the tent in one direction, and that's when my dad threw open the back door and did one of those high-pitched dad whistles and ran towards the tent yelling us to get out, gun in hand. We ended up sleeping inside that night. A few weeks later, when we were headed down to the gravel mine for target practice, a massive pit in the ground about a mile away from our home, and we saw a mountain lion on the other side, and Dad murmured to me that it must be my friend. It was massive and terrifying and beautiful, and I haven't ever seen another in person. I was out climbing in the Rockies around Banff, Canada with some friends. It was a nice, normal day and everyone was just working on their routes. It was a quiet area with only a few routes, so it was just the three of us out there. All of a sudden a loud trumpet/deep air horn kind of noise breaks the silence. It goes off a couple of times, no idea what it was, never heard it before, never heard it again. Not something I saw, but rather, something I heard. This past summer, my girlfriend and I thru-hiked the Colorado Trail. One morning, we're breaking down our camp and the sun had just come up, so it was still pretty early in the morning, maybe around 6 to 6:30 a.m. We were camped in this long straight valley, in the Lost Creek Wilderness, for any fellow CT through hikers. As we're packing up and getting ready to start hiking again, we can hear this crazy screaming sound, over and over again for maybe a couple minutes. It sounded pretty far off but was echoing through the valley. We both sat there and listened to it, trying to figure out what it was. I have spent a lot of time in the Colorado mountains and have never heard this sound before. At first, we thought it may have been a person, but we were at a fairly remote section of the trail. Once we finished, we did some research and we think it may have been a mountain lion, as they sometimes will make a similar screaming noise, but who knows. We were both a little nervous to start hiking again after that. I was just past the Lost Creek Wilderness, Denver to Durango, when I had the scariest night ever. Some kind of large cat was walking around my camp. It knocked over my pack, which was leaning against a tree nearby. My food was safely hanging somewhere far off. Then it just paced around and seemed like it was wanting to play. I was scared shitless. This was summer 2016 and I was through hiking solo with my 5-pound Chihuahua. Luckily my dog was smart enough to stay at the bottom of my sleeping bag and not make a peep. I didn't sleep at all that night and took pictures of big cat prints in the morning all over the place. I met an older couple the following day and spent the next couple nights camping with them. I'd hike it again though. Best experience of my life. I was just wandering on a volcanic beach when I saw a cave. Little me, 7-year-old, went in, a little farther than the entrance where I still could see. There I saw human hairs, a lot of them, plus the rotten algae, and the sea smell made an awful smell. That scared the shit out of me, and scared me of hairs for a while. Never talked about it but discovered that someone drowned there with a body never discovered. It still scares me when I think about it. Definitely not unexplainable but sent chills down my spine just the same. For context, I'm 25 and female with a long history of doing stuff out in nature all by my lonesome. Sorry, Mom and Dad. Last year I quit my job as a cheesemaker and hopped on a train for a position as a line cook at a little rundown family-owned Greasy Spoon on the res right outside Glacier National Park in Montana. They had a little trailer park out back for the staff and I got to live in a one-room cabin the manager's granddad built back in the day. The park itself was just a 15-minute walk from my cabin, and I often went hiking on the Red Eagle Lake Trail, since it was the one trail I didn't need to wait around for a shuttle to access, and it tended to get less traffic than the others. I'd gone out there hoping to do lots of backcountry camping, but the cafe worked us like dogs 6 days a week usually, so I only made it out twice on a couple solos. Now, at Red Eagle Lake there are 2 campsites, the upper and lower. The first time I camped I stayed at the lower campsite, which is usually more busy. The second and last time, right before I returned home, I stayed at the smaller upper campsite. When I got there I hung up my bear hang, set up my tent, and spent some time poking around the lake and watching deer till it got dark. Around 2 a.m. I woke up to snuffling noises and loud, hollow footsteps right outside my tent door. Being half asleep and a dumbass, I completely unzipped my door. I meant to unzip the window, but the whole door opened and I found myself looking up at a huge bull moose the size of a SUV. He had been just munching on huckleberry shrubs. He froze when he heard my door unzip, they don't see very well, hesitated a moment, and then shot off into the hills faster than I could ever imagine something that big moving. Scared the shit out of me. I kept hearing other moose around me throughout the night, and actually it was kind of comforting. No spooky mountain lions or paranormal spooks could possibly be around if there were moose, right? The next morning I packed up and was humping my shit out past the lower campground. It had been empty when I passed it the day before, but now I noticed there was a group of a half dozen guys there. Now, I met lots of dudes on the trail and 99.99% of them are perfectly friendly, really chill, and harmless, but as I walked through this campground every head snapped up and clocked me as I passed through and I felt panic alarms go off in my gut. They all stood totally still and didn't say a word. I had to walk right past one of these guys at the bear hang and he just leered at me creepily and said, "Hey!" I was wearing big, black sunglasses and in my best lady bro voice shot back, "Hey yo, what's up?" And then tried not to poop myself as I marched up the trail till they couldn't see me. I've spent a lot of time in the woods alone, and have often been grateful that I'm a taller, sort of stocky, and kind of androgynous lady. I've also spent a lot of time wandering Seattle late at night and early in the morning. That by far was the most in danger I've ever felt. Don't want to feel that way ever again. Nope. I'm Australian. I once encountered an osprey and a fox engaged in a Mexican standoff over a fish the osprey had plucked from a river and dropped, and had landed to retrieve. It was still flopping about. Very surreal. They didn't fight, the fox snatched it after about 20 seconds and fled. Not incredibly creepy, more odd, but here it goes. A little over a year ago my ex and I traveled to Yellowstone and spent most of the nights of our trip backcountry camping. On one of our last nights we made it out to our reserved campsite around dusk and had just enough light to set up our tent and spot another tent at another campsite across a small pond from us, maybe 150 yards away or so. As we're cooking dinner we hear a man, presumably at the other campsite across the way, abruptly yell, "Hey bear!" To which we both felt very startled, quickly finished with our dinner, hung our food in a tree and made it into our tent. Neither of us saw or heard any signs of a bear and figured the other camper may have been practicing good bear safety by letting potential nearby bears know he was there. Later in the evening after finishing some sexy time I sit up in the tent and look over across the pond to see what looks like headlamp or flashlight coming from the man's tent across the pond, and I notice that he seems to be pointed in our general direction and flashing it at odd intervals. I watched this for a while, then more amused than creeped out at this point decided it would be fun to join in. So I grab my headlamp and blink my light back at the man when he finishes flashing his, only to see him seem to respond by flashing his back. This went on for several minutes, and later a light appeared at the top of a small nearby mountain that appeared to be doing the same thing back to us. I don't know Morse code, or am familiar with any kind of camping/hiking etiquette around signaling others with your headlamp/flashlight, but I'll always wonder what they might have been saying to me and me to them that night. Not actually a fish and wildlife biologist, but I practically live on the outdoors. This is pretty mild, but it gave me chills when it happened. So I like to explore and fish a lot. They coincide a lot anyways, so it's a pretty big passion of mine. I was hiking along a creek in a rural county near my home, in some dense game lands about 8 or so miles from any house, probably at least double that from a major road or settlement. I had hiked for a while and was seeing hardly any sign of human presence. Nearly every place I go in my state I can find garbage, hunting trash or any other sign that people have been there. If I see nothing, it is sort of a good sign that the area is undisturbed. As I was hiking I heard gunshots far away, not uncommon either, but the forest was weirdly quiet, and yes, cliché incoming. I felt super uneasy, as if there was another someone there. Eventually I found something really strange, and I've looked for the picture forever but can't find it. It was a small metal box, and I was well versed enough to know it was a geocache, out in the open at the base of a tree. Let me remind you, this is several miles through thick woods and no sign of human habitation or influence. The box was rusty and looked to have been through a lot. I tried opening it, but a lot of sediment and rust had accumulated and I got a little give, but nothing significant. There was definitely stuff rattling around, so I tried a ton, but nothing would work. I realized that this story is probably boring and there was probably nothing even in it, but it seemed very strange to find this so far out. I knew I had to get it open somehow. I left it as I found it and put a piece of duct tape on the tree next to it to find it again. I left and went home. I downloaded the geocaching app, but the box wasn't registered anywhere, nor were there really any geocaches along that creek at all, none registered for miles. So either it wasn't a geocache or maybe just really old. Anyways, the very next day I went back, armed with a crowbar, hammer and pliers. I went back to the exact spot it was and I knew it was the right spot. The duct tape was balled up on the ground beside the tree and the box was nowhere to be found. I looked all around and couldn't find it, at which point, several miles from civilization and several more from cell service, I booked it out of there. I realize this isn't that creepy, spooky, supernatural etc., but this put me on the edge more than anything else I've ever been through. Hiker, but I saw this in my backyard, in the bushes beside my deck. Inspecting a couple spider webs and looking where they may be, I spot one right in the middle of its web. I settle in with my beer and notice a wasp-looking thing head for the first web I noticed. I thought it would fly in and get trapped, but it seemed to notice it and inspected it. Then the waspy thing landed where an anchor point was on the leaf, and sniffed around. Took off flying and looked around before discovering the second web, which it did the same too, with the same success. Then it flew to the third web with the spider in the middle and the spider just dropped. No web to defend from, it just let go of the web when the waspy thing approached. It hit the edge of my table and deflected to the ground where it balled up, for defense. The waspy thing went to the table and sniffed around a bit before descending to the floor in search of the spider. I looked for it and couldn't find it. The spider ball was gone. The waspy thing searched for it, sniffing with its antennae, and myself searching with my eyes. But it was gone. One more spider escaped from the waspy thing gang. The weird thing is the spider knew. My husband and I were hiking in Jasper Park, Canada. We were talking and passing other hikers every 15 to 20 minutes or so. We got to a part of the trail that reaches the peak, and then slowly starts to move down the side of a foothill, and the trail is on the side of a slope. We hadn't seen anyone in maybe 30 minutes. All of a sudden the entire earth started to shake and there was a thunderous noise. We both squat down together and looked frantically around, trying to find the source of the noise, but we saw nothing and heard nothing like branches breaking. I thought for sure it was an elk or something, but if there was an animal, it would have been on the trail either ahead of us or behind us. We started to make loud noises and I started cracking 2 rocks together. We kept doing this until we saw another couple hikers about 15 minutes later. We asked if they heard or felt anything and they said no, so we warned them that there may be an animal on the trail ahead. It would be nice to know what it was. When I was younger, probably in the 6th grade, I was at one of my dad's fishing camps. This one happened to be a 1987 Dodge Sportsman rotting in some old logging camp about 2 hours north of where I live. I always hated going because my dad always day drank there and had a general lack of regard for safety, departing in a 14-foot aluminum fishing boat with a 20-year-old 8.5 horsepower motor while you're hammered with your kid and his friend, for example. One time when we were there, I can distinctly remember bright, consistent flashes about every 3 seconds that lit up half the sky on the horizon. I still don't know what it is. I've seen something similar whilst tending at a local campground. It was so dim that it was hardly noticeable. When I saw it up at the fishing camp, it was almost as bright as lightning. At the local campground I assumed it was maybe a lighthouse or something, because the campground wasn't too far inland from Lake Superior. However, the fishing camp is nearly a 2-hour drive north. I'm going to guess that it had something to do with the nearby Lac des Iles mine. However, now that I'm thinking about it, I think I remember the flashes coming from the east. The mine is to the south. I haven't been there in probably 3 years, and it's been half a dozen since that took place. So that's about all I can remember. I'm going to go look on Google Earth later to see if there's anything east of the camp or just look for a plausible source of the illumination. I know the original question didn't say campers, but fishing/tending/camping kinda go hand in hand with what the op was referring to. I was hiking in the Carpathian Mountains and got a chance to talk with the local mountain rangers. A lone hiker had passed the ranger's cabin wearing sneakers as footwear and without gloves. It being winter, The rangers had told the guy that he's not properly equipped and should probably turn back, but without effect. Once it had been dark for a few hours and there was no sign of the hiker returning, they headed out for rescue. The guy was luckily found alive. He was lying bleeding in a pit in the snow with bloodstains all over himself and the surroundings. It turned out he had read that cutting your hands will keep you warm and prevent your fingers getting frostbitten. Maybe this guy got his mountain survival tips from the same source anti-vaxxers get their medical advice? Not really unexplainable, but the most scared I've been in the woods. I was riding my bike home from my girlfriend's house and had to cross through a river area that had just flooded. There were so many glowing things in my bike lights. Ghostly looking branches, metal debris, beady animal eyes. It was in the spring and a lot of animals were moving around. Every noise was loud and I had more prickles up my spine than any other time I'd ridden there or in the dark. Super creepy seeing trees on the ground covered in dried clay, looking like huge bones. It felt so strange to be within half a mile of civilization, yet feeling so trapped in the woods. I am none of those things, but walking out to check my mail one time there was a wet brown patch on the dry grass. I assumed it was crap and avoided it. After a few days of it not drying at all and getting a bit lighter, I poked it with a stick and then smelt the stick and it was barbecue sauce. Like someone had just squirted out a whole bottle of barbecue sauce in a patch on the grass. No idea who or why. Not my own personal story, but it's my brother's. He interned for the forestry department one summer after college. He was set up in a cabin in a remote part of some state park and alone all summer. After his internship ended, he came home and we all had a nice family dinner to welcome him back. We all were excited to hear about living in the Sold and what it was like. He told us about the serenity of nature and how loud yet quiet it was at the same time. Someone, not sure who, asked what the creepiest thing was. He looked at us all with this look of pure confusion and fear. Almost like if you saw Bigfoot. He went on to tell us about this strange creature that lived under his front porch. He kept saying it was the strangest thing ever. It was like a cat that barked like a dog and it would bark at him every night. He swore up and down that it was something out of an old Native American myth and had to be supernatural because, of course, cats can't bark. We were all very curious and asked him to describe it. He said it was red, the size of a small dog, and had this big fuzzy tail. My other brother held up his phone and asked him if this was the strange creature he saw. He explained yes with the most amount of pure shock I've ever seen. It was a fox. My 24-year-old brother who wanted to work as a forest ranger had, apparently, never seen a fox before. Needless to say, he didn't get a job offer. I live next to a national park. As in, you go to my back fence, hop over it, and you're in the park. It's a pretty well-traveled one. I usually feel perfectly at ease in there because I'm in Australia, so worst I have to worry about is snakes. No bears, no mountain lions, and we're old hat at dealing with spiders, so they're no big deal. One night I was asleep at home, in bed, when I heard something large sniffing under my window. It was crunching around in there, grunting loudly. I have never heard anything like it before or since. All I can think is maybe it's a wombat, but we don't get them around here. Not a clue. As a kid, my parents took my brother and I camping in an Apache pop-up trailer. One trip, we went to Yellowstone National Park. Per the warnings, we took our ice chest into the trailer each night. One night, I heard something scrape the door. Didn't think anything of it. The next morning we got up to see a bunch of people looking at our door. Came outside to find 3 6-inch long black marks that were most likely a bear. Luckily the creature did not puncture the door's flimsy metal. When I was a kid, my dad, my bro and I would go hiking/camping a lot in the area around Mount St. Helens and Mount Rainier. We made camp one day and eventually noticed a horrible, foul smell coming from who knows where. We assumed it was a dead animal. Also found a kind of lean-to and tarp structure like maybe a survivalist or homeless person would live in. Anyways, we left and several weeks later my dad learned that a lady was murdered and buried there and wasn't found until after we had been there. I don't know if my dad contacted authorities and that's why she was found, or if it was just coincidence. So the smell was this dead lady. I didn't find this out until years later, as I was like 8 when it happened. My husband, kid, and I live out in the middle of nowhere on a plot of land that's about 100 acres. I'd say probably 95 of those acres are wilderness with ATV and hiking trails that we, and several of the previous owners, created by exploring. We use that land for camping, hiking, and hunting. We like to find a spot, clear it a bit, and camp overnight. There's so much space we've never stayed in the same place twice. We've seen some kill sites, both old and fresh. Lots of animal tracks, places where deer bed down, etc. I've even spent a lot of time hiking solo while the kid is in school and husband's at work. Whether alone or with the family, we always carry a firearm for protection. A few weeks ago, we decided to load up our camping gear and start a new trail. We mark the trails we make with spray paint on trees. We were pretty far in the woods, having hiked almost an hour when the atmosphere seemed to change. I don't know who noticed it first, but my husband, who was leading the three of us, turned around and gave me a concerned look. The birds had stopped chirping, the insects were quiet. There were no sounds around us. When in the woods, complete quietness is rarely a good thing. We continued onward, hyper-aware of our surrounds while our kid continued merrily talking. We came to the stream that marks the midway point of our property. We stopped for a few minutes, my husband and I, in a stare down with each other. We both felt something was off but didn't want to scare our daughter. I finally broke the silence and said I suddenly didn't feel good and that we should go home. My husband nodded in agreement while our daughter voiced her protest. "Too bad, kiddo." We turned around and started back. After going a few hundred yards, still in silent wilderness, I looked to my right and saw a person crouched down in a ghillie suit about 150 feet off our trail. I'm positive they saw that I noticed them, but they never moved. I cleared my throat to get my husband's attention, and when he looked back, I put my hand on the gun in the holster on my hip, which caused him to readjust his rifle in preparation of anything. I sped up my family and we hurried back home. I told my husband as soon as we were inside. We decided to call the police and report the trespasser. Filed the report and was told to call again if we saw anyone. A few days later, my husband and I went out alone and set up a bunch of deer cams. We didn't go back out into the woods for maybe a week, then he and I ventured out to retrieve the cam footage. Out of the 9 cams we placed, we caught a person in a ghillie suit and 2 images. We handed copies over to the cops to go with our report. We haven't gone back out since except to check the deer cams. Haven't gotten any other trespassers. It freaks me out even more to think of the few times, while camping, that we heard walking near our tent in the middle of the night. We always assumed it was curious animals, but now I'm not so sure. A while ago I was guiding student groups on a farm in Balliol Reserve. We stayed in an old farmhouse, some rooms were turned into dorm rooms. One day a staff member went to fetch some sand from a dry riverbed nearby. He needed to make some cement. He came back saying he saw tracks of an animal that he'd never seen. He had some of his colleagues have a look. They all said the same thing, so by now I'm intrigued and I go down to the riverbed to have a look. Sure enough, there they are. Like a buffalo, but not exactly the round shape you'd expect. Seemed like 2 pairs of buffalo tracks. Then I saw it. That's not 2 pairs. It's 4 pairs, of an animal walking upright. Goosebumps all over. Hair on my neck standing straight up. I called the warden. He came with his new sniffer dog. That dog went to work, but it was obvious those strange animals knew we were on them. Out the reserve, over the railway line, back in the reserve, then again onto another farm, all the way to the horse stables at the edge of Hoodsporoy town. That's where we caught the last one, hiding in the stables. But there were 4 in total. The one we got first broke a leg when jumping over the fence of the reserve. 2 others tried to hide under the railway line. Later we also found the rifle, which they had thrown away while running, a .308 with a silencer. We also found bullets and a panga. Now we could charge them with something else than trespassing. They didn't make a victim, that time. But they are successful regularly. All our anti-poaching efforts are like mopping with a running tap. I think our rhino are on the way out. We try to fight the symptoms, but cannot fight the cause, and no one seems to care on the whole planet, for just a few species, lion, rhino, elephant, pangolin, no one puts political pressure on any country in the Far East. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.